We are thrilled today to have Paul Ware with us all the way from New Zealand, where he's just informed us it is actually already tomorrow. So it is the February 3rd at 11 a.m. And here we are at 5 p.m. on the 2nd where we are. So Paul, thank you for being here. Paul is the son of Inez, who is a wonderful part of RiverArts. And once we heard a little bit more about Paul and what he's up to and where he lives and some of his travel experiences, we knew he'd be the perfect person to share some of his insights with us. So I wanted to start with a quote. The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. And that's Marcel Proust. And I know that Paul's going to talk today about the differences between the global East and West, but I think that started for him with where he was born and then travel. And so I'm always just reminded that, seeing people and places from a new perspective is what makes us learn and grow. And Paul is a researcher at the School of Public Health at the University of Auckland and loves to travel and has lived many places. So we're thrilled to have you here today, Paul. And thank you very much for being here. Inez, do you have any other? I think we're good. Again, Inez gave us a lovely little tribute a few minutes ago about her son, and we'll let you take it away, Paul.
Oh, cool. Well, hi everyone, and honestly, I was flattered to be asked to come and talk, and thanks for asking me to talk. So, just a couple of things I want to say first, out of like a nervous compulsion to preparation. I've written what I want to say down. So a lot of the stuff I'm going to be talking about, I'm just going to be reading out. So I don't want to miss anything out.
Brother who lives in New Zealand.
And I know this is like a discussion group, so maybe reading something out doesn't fit in as well with a discussion group. Please interrupt me at an opportune moment if there's something you want to chip in with, or a question that you have on the basis of like what I've said, that sort of thing. Okay, so as Anne mentioned, I'm the son of a regular attendee here, Inez. And during the day, I'm a health sociologist and researcher. I've spent most of my time researching in the addictions field, but as of August last year, I began work on a PhD looking at a cross-cultural comparison between several countries' responses to COVID and their forms and levels of social cohesion, the ideas that bring societies together and how these might be expressed in outcomes from COVID. So, and New Zealand and Taiwan are two of the case studies I'm using in that. So this is part of where my particular interest in these countries and differences between East and West come from. So today I'm going to talk about these cultural differences, focusing specifically on New Zealand and Taiwan. There are many axes of difference that I could be talking about. I could be talking about geography, demographics, food. I'm going to be talking about something that I've been reading about and I have a particular interest in, and that's these deeply embedded cultural ideas and their translation to everyday life. So the topics I'm going to cover are inherently political, and from what I know, and have read about your group about RiverArts, I think I'll probably be I'll be in good company here, but I just want to own my politics from the start, because it's important to make one's bias clear when one talks about political ideas. So my politics are radical, humanitarian, environmentalist. My prescriptions for positive social change are structural, seek equality, and aim for those big juicy pieces of fruit you're going to need to climb to the highest branch of the tree into a precarious position to pluck. My approaches to the topics we're talking about should be understood in this context. Also, I want to say that the sort of topics I'm talking about there, one can never hope in a lifetime to understand them completely, and I'm sure many of you have done reading around and probably directly on the topics I'm talking about. So if you've got something to add to develop my thinking, brilliant. Please chime in. If you want to correct an inaccuracy, I'm sure there'll be some. Then please chip in and correct any inaccuracies, and that'll make for a more enriching discussion. Okay. So before I share screen, I've got some slides with some pictures and some words. I'll share the screen, but does anyone got any comment to make or questions before I get on with it?
I'd just like to say I really liked your statement, owning your politics. That was helpful
Oh, yeah.
and very well put. Thanks.
Yeah, right. I think it's important, particularly in issues of social science and politics, that we make clear our political stances from the start, because this is important for interpretation of what people are saying and the positioning of it. Okay, can everyone see this? Everyone see the slide we've got here? Okay, awesome. So yeah. On the top left is obviously Taiwan and the flag. Bottom right is New Zealand and what the flag should be, but isn't. We've still got the colonial flag, but this is what it should be. Anyway, that's another story. Okay, so I think it's important to start with some negative confessions, like things I won't talk about, or perhaps things I won't do justice to because we've only got 45 minutes. So this is a huge topic, as no doubt when you read the outline of the talk, how are we going to do this in 45 minutes? So the short answer is you can't do it in 45 minutes. So quite often this is going to be quick and dirty, a little bit reductionist and simplified. So I apologize for that for the start, but I hope it can be interesting and give access to some ideas anyway. So there are a number of different Easts and Wests, each with their own distinct origin myths and histories. And that, although there are strong claims that we can group East and West, I just want to acknowledge that talking about New Zealand, talking about Taiwan doesn't necessarily talk about the whole East and the whole West. And I think and the diversity within these groups are why I've chosen to talk about two particular case studies. And I've chosen these in particular, well, first because the work I'm doing, and second because I've got particular interest, because I live in New Zealand and I love the country, and second, and Taiwan, because I have a particular interest because my partner Karen is of Taiwanese descent. So I'll leave it to you to decide whether things being discussed might or might not be applicable to other countries. My personal feeling is there's a lot of things that we can discuss that are, some things perhaps not so much. So even within these specific countries, there are many ideas and their evolutionary lineages one could focus on, and one could never hope to cover them all in a lifetime. So for this reason, I've chosen to focus within these countries on what I've come to consider some of the most important founding national ideas: liberalism for New Zealand and Confucianism for Taiwan. And so to explain these pictures, we've got Adam Smith in the bottom left, and he's one of the godfathers of liberalism. We've got Confucius in the bottom right, and obviously he's the godfather of Confucianism. And we've got a picture of the COVID virus in the top right, and this is to represent what the growing international attention on New Zealand and Taiwan because of their particular responses to the unfolding, raging pandemic. And if we've got a little bit of time at the end, I think it'll be interesting to talk about how these ideas, how one might see these ideas mapped on the different responses and outcomes to COVID between New Zealand and Taiwan, but only if we've got time. So, and finally, for examples to allow a comparison about how these are materialized differently in each country, these sets of ideas, I'll consider how each has responded to the stresses placed on them in recent history by the rapidly gathering forces of globalization. And there's a particular event in each country that I'm going to talk about, which indicates how these ideas have materialized in their individual and different responses to COVID. And I'm going to make the argument that each might learn something from the other, though the Eastern contingent has definitely got a head start in learning from outside. Okay, so first off, it would be good to have a definition of what culture is, because there are many definitions, so it's good that we'll be talking about the same thing. So I'm going to use a definition that I like that spans anthropology and critical sociology. So anthropology, and we've got Margaret Mead here, one of the stalwarts, a really important person in the history of anthropology. Anthropology in general calls culture the shared patterns of daily life, and has used this definition to investigate the minutiae of groups connected initially by geography, later by socioeconomics, interest, ethnicity, etc. So, anthropology calls it the shared patterns of daily life. Critical sociology, and we've got Michel Foucault down the bottom right here. He's one of the greatest thinkers I've ever read anything about. So a lot of love for Michel Foucault, so I couldn't go through a presentation without mentioning his name. Critical sociology does a better job of attending to the more abstract processes. Where do these shared patterns of daily life come from, and how do they become ingrained? So I'm not going to talk about the theory too much here. People go glassy-eyed and make excuses to leave when I start talking about the theory. But just as a background, and for those who are interested, my ideas are grounded in French sociology. This man, Michel Foucault, he pointed to the historical genesis and development over time of particular ideas and knowledge systems, and how they become embedded in the physical and institutional structures we build around us, and the identity stories we tell ourselves and others. So the intersection of historical ideas, norms and values, the evolving networks and concentrations of power, the crystallization of these two in the identities, the crystallization in these two in the forms of architecture and institutions, and the reflections to and from the identities of individuals is this slow-moving ocean liner that we can call culture. So, in summary, I'm calling culture here the shared patterns of living across societies which produce and are produced by an evolving lineages of ideas and values attached to a society. And I just want to begin the meat of the talk with a quote from John Maynard Keynes, which I just came across this morning actually, and I thought it was brilliant. Please excuse the masculine pronoun, but this is a quote from someone else, they're excluding women, I apologize for that. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. And I love this quote. He's talking about how if we don't reflect on the ideas that have driven our culture and as a result driven our own identity, then we become the slaves to the dominant ideas which we know nothing about. And usually it's some defunct economist, as we'll see in the case of New Zealand in particular. Okay, so in line with the definition of culture I've given, if we're going to understand the organization of society currently, then we need to understand how ideas and practices have evolved into what they are now. So although New Zealand society is currently dominated by the values of those that came at a later date, no account of New Zealand, historically or currently, is correct or complete without recognizing the place of Maori. I apologize for the foreign language on here. I'll explain what each of these words mean. Don't be intimidated by them, and it's not so complex. But I think it's particularly in light of myself as a British person, as a part of the colonizing wave that's arrived in New Zealand, to do my bit to acknowledge the fact that Maori own the land and to present Maori concepts in their own form. And if I did anything else, I would be part of the colonization problem. So Maori culture is rich and complex, and there have been many long works describing its features. I'm just going to cover a couple of things, a couple of concepts, a couple of the important ones here. So Maori arrived in around 1300 from a chain of migration, most probably beginning in Taiwan, moving across Polynesia, and they settled the land they call Aotearoa, or land of the long white cloud. They call themselves tangata whenua, which means people of the land. In this self-identification, there is an accumulation of ideas and values. So first, that the people arise from the earth and return to it in the same way that plants and animals do. So the people and the land are part of the same process. Also, that all natural life contains the expression of ancestors. If your ancestors have returned to the land and the trees rise up from the land, for Maori, the trees then are the expression of their ancestors and are therefore sacred. So this cements the importance of kaitiakitanga, which means, simply put, the guardianship of nature, the importance of the guardianship of nature, which also becomes the guardianship of your genealogical lineage. So Maori historically are a collective culture. A good example of how ingrained this is. So when I was learning about Maoridom from a Maori colleague in Auckland, I asked about the basis of social cohesion in Maori society. She laughed at me approaching the topic from such a Western perspective. We live cohesion, she said. We don't give it a name because it's the water we swim in. And so I learned something in that moment. Māori have 3 collectives, which form the basic social unit depending on context. And each exists within the other. So the first is whānau, which is the extended family, hapu, which is a close group of families, and iwi, which is the broader tribal group. And each of these, each iwi is descended from a specific waka or canoe, which arrived from the islands. And it's really important to Māori to trace their lineage back to the original waka they come to, and these form the tribal groups, the social groupings, and they're geographically positioned throughout the country. So of equal importance to these groups is whakapapa, or genealogical lineage. And this is where the respective ancestors comes in. And particular prominent ancestors are designated atua, or protections of all things sacred, or tapu. Tapu concerns behaviours like childbirth or sitting on tables, or places like motu tere or te puna o riwaka. And we've got the picture on the top right there is motu tere, known by the Europeans as Castle Rock, and there's some rock climbing happening. And there's te puna o riwaka, or the Riwaka Resurgence, which is on the South Island. There's some swimming happening, beautiful places, and they are sacred, or tapu, for Maori. Okay, so then the European, or as they're called by Maori, Pākehā cultural history. So the Abel Tasman, Dutchman, he was the first to arrive from Europe to visit New Zealand in the 17th century, though he never set foot on the land and just looked over from the ship. James Cook arrived from Britain in the late 18th century, and from this point, greater numbers of people began to arrive in earnest. Through the early 19th century, New Zealand was a bit of a wild west. It was visited by opportunists, traders, and some with ill intentions. The New Zealand Company, set up by ex-convict Edward Wakefield, did a series of dodgy land deals that fleeced both Māori and settlers. Muskets were sold to some iwi who used them to overpower and enslave others. Even the French turned up and started trying to claim parts of the country. Maybe this was the last straw. Britain then decided to make it New Zealand a full-blown colony and undertake an organized settlement. This also allowed them to alleviate some of the pressures that were building up in their overpopulated, underemployed, and unsanitary cities, which were beginning to run with stories of the French Revolution. The Treaty of Waitangi was signed between the Crown and most Māori in 1842, and the first government was assembled 10 years later. Settlement began in earnest, chiefly British. There was a racially motivated discouragement of Irish people, but other Europeans, and overwhelmingly working class people, seeking the opportunity for social mobility in a well-marketed Little Britain colonial utopia. The major philosophical set underpinning the broad British colonial project was classical liberalism, derived from the works of such thinkers as John Locke, Robert Malthus, and Adam Smith, who built on the earlier Enlightenment thinkers. Although the term liberal has evolved and morphed somewhat over the past few centuries, and as Americans, you'll no doubt be quite familiar with the principles of the different liberalisms, it's important to differentiate at the start between the liberalism towards economic activity, which was more prominent in the classical liberalism of the colonial project, and the social liberalism, which is quite prominent now, where the former obviously relates to economic behavior, trade and property. The latter relates to more to the live and let live principles, which have contributed to things like LGBTQIA equality and relaxation of drug laws, that sort of thing. Okay, so classical liberalism positioned the individual as the basic social unit around which laws and responsibilities accumulate. The idea that each human is motivated only by rational self-interest was championed by this philosophy. Society was said to be held together by a perfect balance of individual economic interests and trajectories. Drawing on Hobbes' notion that government was a response to humans' inherently nasty and brutish nature, the role of governance was to protect each individual from the other, preserve the conditions in which a free market may exist, and operate those few life-sustaining necessities which the free market could not provide. There's obviously a lot more to it than this, but it's this set of ideas which still underpins much of the rationale for laissez-faire capitalism. Interestingly, given the late point in the British colonial project that New Zealand was colonised, the classical liberalism that could provide moral justification for the purchase of large tracts of land from the indigenous people for such trinkets as blanket, guns and beads, was accompanied by the burgeoning influences of John Stuart Mill's more progressively utilitarian informed new liberalism, the end of the economic boom driven by colonial expansion, and the emergence of political agitation in the working classes for better working conditions than those horrific conditions of early industrial capitalism. Yeah, and I've got the pictures here, that same picture of Adam Smith again, and we've got John Stuart Mill, the godfather of the new liberalism, which incorporated some of his mentor Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism and slightly more progressive ideals. So on the basis of that brief, quick and dirty history, what can we say has happened in New Zealand culture as a result of this nation building trajectory? So we can say that one of the oldest and most important values to which the country provided a home is the connection with, respect for and guardianship of the natural world, so the Maori kaitiakitanga. This continues to be of major importance both to Maori and Pākehā New Zealanders, such that, for example, the Green Party has been part of, has received countrywide high support more than in most other places, and has been part of the government for the last 2 terms and previous terms. And the Green Party has more power and the single issue environmentalist party, though they're migrating to social issues as well, recognizing the intersection between environmental and social issues, but they're a single issue environmental party in general, and they've been in government for the last 2 terms, coalition government. Secondly, New Zealand's settlement was propelled by a working class struggle. This, in concert with the liberal ideology brought from the old world, has placed the opportunity for economic self-determination and social mobility at the centre of the network of cultural values. I think I missed a couple of Maori principles, perhaps. I did miss one really important Maori principle. I'm sorry, that I want to come back to, because this is important. So mana plays an important role in individual conduct. This refers to an accumulation of skill, wisdom, fairness, charisma, power, and respect. Mana is said to be inherited at birth by one's lineage and the conditions in which one is born. It is not completely preordained, though. One must both express mana and have mana validated by others. One's mana governs one's status in the social structure. If one behaves in an inappropriate way, one's mana is diminished. Of special, and this point is the point I want to make that I realized that I'd missed out on, of special importance to mana is rangatiratanga, which means self-determination, the ability for whānau, hapu, and iwi to choose their own direction. And I apologize for having to go back and confusing the order of things, but rangatiratanga is a really important principle of Maoridom, self-governance, self-determination, and this has found its way into the New Zealand cultural lineage of ideas. So coming back to that, social mobility, so New Zealand settlement propelled by a working class struggle. This, in concert with the liberal ideology brought from the old world, has placed the opportunity for economic self-determination and social mobility at the centre of the network of cultural values. And this is spoken to also by the Māori rangatiratanga struggle. New Zealand, as with every society colonised within the last 500 years, displays the wounds of colonialism still, an indigenous people who suffer unequal access to resources, opportunity and health, and a society that carries the weight of this inequality to the detriment of all. This is exacerbated by the fact that there were 2 versions of the Treaty of Waitangi signed between Māori and the Crown. The Māori version and the English version do not mean the same thing. And there's been ongoing struggle and legal battles over decisions made based on the different versions of the treaty between Māori and Pākehā. There's been a long and familiar history of suppression of culture, disenfranchisement, and both structural and everyday racism that has burdened Māori, but has also found its way leaking into the disadvantaging of people of other ethnicities, most notably Pacific peoples. So although the spirit in which colonialism was undertaken in New Zealand was heavily imbued by the classical liberalism that the British had spread throughout the world, As the value set had started to evolve by the time they arrived in New Zealand, a seedling of progressivism was planted in the cultural soil. This took root, and over the years, it's sometimes been fruitful and other times been aggressively pruned by different ideologically motivated landscapers. An early example of this seedling of progressivism is found in New Zealand being the first country to recognize that women were just as deserving as of a say in a democratic state as men, and instituting universal suffrage in 1893. This progressivism, the visible wrongs of colonialism, and the vast differences between the individualist liberal capitalist culture of the British and then the Maori cultural values of collectivism and fierce attachment to self-determination, these have combined to produce a somewhat different relationship between colonizers and indigenous than in other societies, one in which Maori are able to have a much greater, though still vastly unequal, voice and opportunity to redress the wrongs of colonial land theft and the decimation of culture than other indigenous peoples. And so I'm going to park New Zealand there for a moment and come back to it and talk about Taiwan for a little while. And I know I've just given you a lot of information and spoken at 100 miles an hour. So I just want to pause and see if there's anyone's got any comments or questions about what I've said about Māori and Pākehā New Zealand culture.
Paul, I find it really fascinating. And I was wondering, would you mind, because I should have asked you this up front, you were born in the UK, is that correct? And you live in New Zealand now. And how long have you been there to be, learning so much about that country?
I was born in UK and I moved in New Zealand. I came here 11th September 2009. So I've been here, it'll be 12 years this September. So I can't say that I've lived here long enough to live the culture, but through my study, I studied sociology at undergraduate level, and a lot of the sociology I studied was New Zealand sociology and cultural sociology. So through reading and research, I've developed some knowledge of the culture, and the political processes and the history, etc. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And I feel like I probably should have asked you to do a salon just on New Zealand and history and culture, because that part itself is incredibly fascinating. So I'm looking forward to hearing about Taiwan and then having that discussion a little bit. But I also know we may run a little close on time. We're always happy to go over a few minutes, but thank you for the great information so far.
So how far have I? Sorry, I haven't been keeping track. How long have we got?
Okay. It's coming up on 5:30, which it does go by way too fast. And
okay, yeah.
And it's really okay, but I just wanted to give you this sense so you know kind of how you want to spend this last little amount of time.
Sure.
And
thank you. Yeah, cool. Okay, Taiwan. So it's next to universally acknowledged among commentators that the ideas and values set out in the philosophies of Confucius have been central to Taiwanese culture since they found their way there with the Han Chinese in the early 1600s. It should be noted, however, that there is also a reaction from some who caution against the over-reliance on Confucian values as an explanation for features of Eastern cultures and societies. Whilst this criticism no doubt has some validity, there is no doubting the importance of Confucianism here. And as I'll suggest, there are particular reasons why it's become especially important to Taiwan. So first, a little on Confucianism. He lived from 551 to 479 BC and led an uneventful life as a low-level politician. The period in which he lived was marked by regional political struggle, bickering, and associated social upheaval, causing Confucius to develop a philosophy of peace, balance, and harmony. This was to be achieved by drawing with reverence on the great leaders and cultures of Chinese history in a conscious effort at building culture and traditions. That is, and this is something I want to come back to as important, intentionally giving direction to culture, this intentional culture. Confucius makes frequent references to Tao, literally translated as path or way, which can be extended to a manner of behaving. He uses Tao to describe both approaches to governance and personal conduct, embodying a large network of essential values. There's considerable variation across translations and commentaries as to which values are most important to to Confucianism, but there's general agreement. The most commonly indicated are benevolence, justice, propriety, filial piety, respect for authority, courtesy, trust and trustworthiness, and reciprocity. all to be actively pursued in individuals' lifelong self-cultivation, with higher status and power bringing greater responsibility to embody these. Taiwan's particular attachment to Confucianism can be understood in light of its relationship with colonialism. Taiwan and its people. So I'm going to skip through this a little bit in acknowledgement of time limitations, but they were colonized first by the Dutch, and they were then who were then booted out, and the Dutch brought the Han Chinese in, who brought Confucianism with them, and the Han Chinese worked for the Dutch in their colonial project in Taiwan, and then the Taiwanese indigenous peoples and the Han Chinese joined forces to kick the Dutch out, along with an army from the mainland, and then following this there were long periods of Chinese and Japanese brutal oppression in Taiwan, which particularly in the Japanese phase, and the moment where Mao Zedong was pursuing this cultural revolution, trying to wipe China clean of traditional ideas and Confucianism in particular. Mao Zedong waged war on Confucianism, so Taiwan became the protector of Taiwanese sovereignty, of their own landmass, but also of these traditional values which were under threat from outside. And so in the Taiwanese national identity, Confucianism and resistance and defense of the self and one's own land and property became tied up with Confucianism. So that's so I apologize for having to zip over the history quite quickly, but time is a concern. Okay, so what can we understand about Taiwan on the basis of this brief history? It's another country that suffered the ills of colonization. Unlike New Zealand's seedling of progressivism and Maori's fierce attachment to rangatiratanga, the waves of empire washing over Taiwan have not left as much space for indigenous cultural expression. They've even had to change their names in order to gain access to state-provided resources. Confucianism's been criticized for being sexist. It's been criticized for excluding sexuality diversity and other things. It's also been criticized for having a tendency to authoritarianism. This intentional culture and this building of a sameness has led to, at times, an authoritarian repression of difference and repression of dissent, which at times has in past, and even recently as the 70s, has been quite brutal. It's not all bad. One can say that there's a long-term commitment to stability, harmony, and social good, which comes from the Confucian ideals. And there's a commitment embedded in Confucianism to social well-being, stability, and a long-term project to bring all of these about. And this is also embedded in Taiwanese culture. Okay, so now I want to talk about these specific events, the responses to globalism that I flagged up in the short introduction. So New Zealand, following the Second World War through the long boom, embarked on an especially socially oriented Keynesian policy trajectory, which became known as the workers' welfare state. In this period, the country came to be seen among policy circles as the Western socialist experiment. This combined the pioneering spirit of the working class colonist with these liberal economic ideals of working fairly for one's lot as an individual, these aspirations of social mobility, and the now further developed new liberal notion that the state has a role in providing a base level of welfare from which individual actors maybe realize liberty to its fullest extent. State policy was aimed at maximizing employment and providing benefits to the families of those who were in work. And it worked. The Minister of Labour was to famously joke in the early 1950s that there were so few unemployed people in New Zealand that he knew them all personally. And depending on which commentary you read, this is close or far away from the truth. So perhaps antithetical to the classical liberal ideals, New Zealand ran a protectionist export economy with high subsidies for primary industry and tariffs on imports. This has been attributed to what James Belich considers New Zealand's recolonization by Britain. The shift in the relationship from New Zealand as a part of a territorial empire to that of an economic vassal state, with the country exporting almost all of its agricultural products to London. According to Bellich, this was reflected by the national identity, which alternated between considering the country and its people as a little Britain or a better Britain, but very much still attached to Britain. This was also evident in immigration and visa policy, which operated on a de facto whites-only model. A pivotal moment in the globalization process sent all of this into disarray. Britain's joining of the EEC, European Economic Community, in 1973 came with trade obligations, and they put heavy levies on New Zealand's imports and goods imported from New Zealand, and this signaled an end to the special relationship. They lost their only trading partner, and New Zealand were effectively economically cut loose. This, alongside the ripple effects of the oil crisis, which occurred in the same year, left New Zealand in significant economic strife. And there was a period of political posturing and discussion about how this would be responded to, which ended in the early 1980s with the recumbent Prime Minister Muldoon famously calling a snap election while drunk, which he lost. And he was replaced by a new outward-looking political managerial class. The pressures of globalization were responded to with a return to and a reformulation of the basic philosophy that arrived in New Zealand with colonialism. That's classical liberalism. And I'm sure you've all know well enough about what this was. And this is Milton Friedman and the Chicago School's neoliberalism. And I've got Keynes and Friedman, the pictures of the two at the bottom. Neoliberalism involved opening up to foreign trade by cutting subsidies and tariffs, the rolling back of the progressive income tax model, deregulation of banking, and the encouragement of overseas banks into the New Zealand market, sell-off of state-owned assets and the restructuring of others towards a business model, cutting of state-provided housing and welfare, the reorienting of immigration policy towards wealthy and economically productive migrants, and the revision of environmental laws. Broadly speaking, the New Zealand state, after remaining static in the face of globalization for almost 40 years, responded to its inability to remain so anymore with shock and awe changes and a wholehearted about turn. It shook itself free of much of the social policy responsibilities and welfare apparatus of the wage earners' welfare state and went about creating the conditions where investors, entrepreneurs, skilled workers, and international capital might be encouraged to undertake their activities in New Zealand under the old theory that a wealthy few might create wealth for all and that Adam Smith's balance of individual interests might make for a stable society. These changes were underpinned by a shift in political rhetoric, echoed in the media, emphasizing individual responsibility and underprivileging the effects of state and structural factors in individual welfare. So the intended social outcomes, as we've seen pretty much everywhere where these ideologies were deployed, didn't come about. New Zealand industry was no longer competitive without its subsidies and with aggressive competition from imports, was forced to shed labour. The working class suffered greatly, particularly Maori and Pacifica people. The racism rose, suicide rates spiked, suicide rates are still high as a result. Privatised public services performed worse for greater money. The housing was the big thing, and the housing crisis has continued until it's at its worst today. And we're still suffering in New Zealand from the effects of the neoliberal changes. Like I've got a list of them here, which I'm not going to read out. I don't have time, but there were significant and harrowing social effects that we still feel effects of, and successive governments, despite tinkering around the edges, haven't been able to change. Okay, I'll try and run through Taiwan quickly and then make some concluding comments. We've got about 5 minutes left. Is that right?
That is just fine. And yeah, I'd love to have time for people to ask some questions at the end. And if you have slides that you haven't had a chance to go over and you want to share them, when we're done, I think it would maybe help reinforce for people. And, we're happy to do that. But go on for now. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, cool. Okay, so for the sake of comparison, I want to point to a moment of similar pivotal importance in Taiwan's development and its relationship with globalization. So similar to New Zealand, through the post-World War II long boom, Taiwan thrived with a state-led export economy. It had a special relationship with, as New Zealand had a relationship with Britain, Taiwan had a special relationship with the United States, who provided aid and open markets so it could make money. Productivity surged, wealth inequality declined up to the 1980s. There were a couple of incidents throughout this time and it was a one-party state, a one-party authoritarian state. A couple of incidents through that time, notably the Zhongli incident, where local elections were found to be rigged by the Chinese associated Kuomintang, and there was a protest which was put down brutally. The leaders of the democracy movement were imprisoned, given long terms of imprisonment. So the moment I wanted to talk about was it came later in 1986. The Taiwan movement, the movement for democracy, again took to the streets in protest, and they formed a formal opposition party, something that was illegal. And it was expected that this was going to be put down brutally again. Onlookers held their breath and expecting this brutal put down, but it didn't happen. The KMT, the existence of formal opposition was tolerated, the bindings of authoritarianism loosened, and a year later martial law was lifted and the presence of opposition parties legally permitted for the first time. Taiwan had recognized the needs and the demands of its people, had recognized the need to change for social stability and harmony, and had opened up and became a democracy. And this stood against the views of the commentators that had talked at length for centuries about how Confucianism might be incompatible with democracy, and Taiwan emerged as a so-called Confucian democracy. Yeah, and we can talk about what Confucian democracy looked like, see if you want to, but I'm just going to skip over that bit. And since then, Taiwan's maintained the economic performance, rode economic downturns better than Western countries, better than other Asian countries, notably the Asian recession in the 1990s and the 2008 global financial crisis. There's significant trade union membership, there's workers' rights, there's a developing welfare state, there's teething troubles, and the old criticisms of patriarchal society are being put to bed with women's liberation. They've got a female, really excellently performing female prime minister, Tsai Ing-wen, and they've become a beacon for the LGBTQIA plus communities in the Far East. They're really liberal attitudes. They've taken on the democracy and the social liberalism, but haven't. But they still have a centrally planned, by and large, although they're giving into international pressure a little bit and liberalizing some industries, they've still got the strong centrally planned, long-term centrally planned economy, which has allowed them strong economic performance alongside a good quality of life for its members. So it hasn't all been rosy. There are problems, and I've got a list of those. But they've combined the Confucian ideals of central planning and social stability with the social liberalism and democracy from the West. So, concluding comments. I'm just going to skip through them quite quickly, cognizant of time. First, something I heard someone say today, I'm at a conference in Wellington, something I heard someone say today: problems created by a system of thought cannot be solved by the same system of thought. And I thought that was really relevant here. So Taiwan and a number of places in the East have looked outside their own system of thought to solve their internal problems. Taiwan's taken on democracy, listened to the demands of its people, taken on democracy, but it's left behind the negative effects of liberalism that we saw, the economic liberalism that we saw cause problems in New Zealand. So, and we can draw this back to the original topic. We can draw this back to Confucian ideals: the state responsibility for social stability, and the state responsibility for really looking after its people, and the long-term planning and intentional culture that supports this. Whereas on the opposite, New Zealand's got a lot more to learn. The major weakness of liberalism and neoliberalism is the distribution of responsibility for the national project, for the trajectory of the country, to individuals and to individual power structures. And and liberalism hasn't learned from outside, and it's tried to solve its problems within, pumping more money into markets, etc. And it's just exacerbated the inequalities and the social harms. So I think the main thing that New Zealand, and again, I've got a long list of things, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through them. I think the main thing that New Zealand can learn from Taiwan in this context, and possibly west from east, is the importance of long-term planning, the importance of a population-centered value system underlying that planning, and the notion of collective well-being, the balancing, the adequate balancing, the careful balancing of individual freedoms and collective well-being. There's a lot more I could have said, a lot more I had written down, but yeah, maybe we can have a discussion if we have time.
Paul, your mention of collective well-being, reminded me. I know Alan Cohen, who I don't personally, but when he signed up, said, I would like to talk a little bit about collectivism in the two different places you're talking about, and maybe where we are now. And I know this relates to your research with COVID and public health. Do you have a couple of thoughts on what you've seen about collective action and ability in both of these places?
Yeah, and so to write this back to the original subject I was talking about, these ideas which bind societies together, and like again the difference between New Zealand and Taiwan, and I think both countries have responded really excellently and with knowledge of their populations to the threat of the pandemic, and where Taiwan kindly learned from. So I think it's more helpful to compare Taiwan's experience of SARS, the first pandemic, to New Zealand's experience of COVID, because this is the first real pandemic threat that New Zealand's had since for a long time. And the Taiwanese, during the SARS pandemic, wore masks straight away. And I think for me, this is a really beautiful representation of the need of their recognition of the need to balance personal freedom and the collective benefit. And it's a small, like, as no doubt you all are aware, it's a small impingement on personal freedom, and the implications for collective benefits are huge. And the Taiwanese unproblematically masked up straight away. And of course, because of their experience of SARS, they were able to do it straight away in this time. Whereas New Zealand still, despite it being the law in Auckland to wear masks on public transport, New Zealanders are not responding well to masking mandates. And New Zealand still are individually focused. And you can draw this all the way back to these ideas that form the basis of the culture, the liberalism, the importance of self-interest. But I think, to comment on the states' responses, I think the states, the different states, not the United States, Taiwan as a state understood that its population were going to be careful on the basis of their respective collective well-being. Taiwan never instituted heavy restrictions. Taiwan said, look, we've got this disease here. This is what you need to do in response to the disease. Wear masks. If you're sick, stay home. They don't even have people are trusted when they've come back into the country to self-isolate at home. So they're trusted to act on collective benefit. Where in New Zealand, when the threat was here, when the threat was really here, we had the strictest lockdown in the developed world. We had the heaviest restrictions in the developed world because the state knew that the population was motivated by individual benefits, and we couldn't afford any slippage. Yeah. And I think this is something you can point to. You guys are all in the United States. This is something that I think you can all recognize in the States, the different balance between the seeking of personal benefit and collective benefit.
Yeah, I'm struck by hearing you say that people in New Zealand were resistant to the mask mandate, or still are maybe resistant to the mask mandate. But you also said when the danger was really here. And our experience here in the US is that people, not everyone, in Chestertown we're pretty good, I think, but in a lot of places in the country are quite resistant. And we still have an enormous problem with the pandemic. So I wonder what made it work in New Zealand that didn't work here.
So there are obvious geographical factors, which are geographical and luck factors, which are in our favor in New Zealand. And we can very easily control our borders. We've got very easy control of our borders, which America doesn't have. We have a very small population, 5 million, which America doesn't have. And COVID-19 got here late compared to other countries. We had the ability to watch what happened in northern Italy. We got to see what happened in New York. And even in the context of that, the government responded very, very late. We left it until the last minute before we reacted as strongly as we needed to. And it'll be the subject of many discussions long into the future as to why it left so late and why that moment in particular was the moment we chose to really take it seriously. But I think those things were in our favor. But also I think something I've talked about is in the talk was this seedling of progressivism. And despite the recent neoliberal history and despite the last 30 years of individualizing individualizing our conceptions of self and culture, I think there is still that seedling of progressivism. There's still that long period between the end of the World War II and the late 1970s, which that still means a lot to New Zealanders. And I think there's still a recognition of collective benefit, a strong recognition of collective benefit there too, and a compliance to both time. So we did a countrywide lockdown and an Auckland only lockdown when there was another outbreak a little bit later. Compliance to both of those was really good. Yeah. So I think there's those factors, geography and this still attachment to the ideas of collective benefit more so than perhaps other countries in the Anglosphere. But also, I think there's definitely something to be said, something you guys will be painfully aware of. There's something to be said for decisive and competent leadership.
Yeah, right. And we did not have, and still not have, and probably will not have that kind of really strict nationwide lockdown that you described.
I think, and part of that is, so Australia might disprove this somewhat, but part of that is the tension between the state and federal system. The state and federal system of governance as well. Yeah, that makes things a bit more complex, and it can go either way. So obviously the state responses in the US were stymied by poor national governance. But in Australia, the only reason why Australia hasn't done as badly is I'm sorry, I'm not making value judgments. The only reason why Australia hasn't seen significant loss of life, like has happened elsewhere, is because the state governance disobeyed the instructions from national government and said, hey, wait a minute, you're not taking this seriously, we're going to ignore you. Yeah, and that saved a lot, and every state basically did that, and that saved a lot of lives. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. I didn't realize that.
Well, what sanctions were handed out to people who didn't obey the mask mandate?
It's still ongoing. So there is the law, the public health order that's become law says that people can be fined. I can't remember the exact fine. It's in the hundreds of dollars, like a couple of hundred, I think maybe up to $600. Don't quote me on that, but there's a fine. But I think something that's marked the police response to the breaking of public health orders. The police have used a lot more discretion in this period than they have done in previous times. Yeah, and it's something that's become of interest to equity-focused people, because obviously, as with every colonized country, Indigenous people bear the brunt of police, the problematic behavior of the police. But this time around, they've acted with a lot of discretion. Yeah. So I think, whereas probably a lot of people have been caught, I don't have numbers, probably a lot of people have been caught without masks on, and I know a lot of people got caught breaking the heavy restrictions that we went through. I think there haven't been as a larger number who have actually been punished for it.
I think there was an attitude in the States of this isn't going to happen to me within certain sectors of society. Has there been an equivalence in New Zealand?
So I was having a conversation with this about this with someone else. I think, and again, to draw it back to the ideas, I think one of the major dangers of liberalism in particular, there is an exceptionalism that happens at the personal level, also happens at the national level. And you've seen it like from the UK, the States, Australia, and it happened here as well. It's not like it's not going to happen to me, it's not going to happen to us. But where, and it definitely did and definitely does exist here. And I think this is where the adept leadership came in. That was recognized and it was channeled into something positive. Not, it's not going to happen to us, but we must make it not happen to us. Yeah, and there was and the communications and policy that was instituted was directed at this, channeling this stream of culture and acknowledgement that this was a danger into a positive outcome here.
Just one of the things I think is probably worth mentioning that you mentioned to me at one point, because I told you I had a friend in the UK who, after I posted that Paul and I had tested positive for COVID, she said she had been afraid to effectively come out because she felt it was something to be ashamed of, something she wasn't prepared to admit. And you talked about how New Zealand handled that, which I think would be beneficial if that was, made clear. If you'd like to go into that, that'd be good.
Yeah, so actually, I think New Zealand's done a really poor job dealing with this. And this is one of the, and this in the sociological literature, this is something that comes up a lot. Inclusion on the basis of sameness results in exclusion on the basis of difference. And this is part of what drives stigma. And part of the response to COVID has been Jacinda Ardern's talking about a team of 5 million, like we are all in this together to keep COVID out. And this has resulted in a number of unintended negative consequences, such as people with COVID, people who've had with COVID or who have had COVID being stigmatized. New Zealanders overseas who want to come home or who have been late coming home being considered social pariahs. They're not inside this team of 5 million. We are a team of 5 million without COVID, within the national borders, with the same principles and the same direction. It's also happened in science. Anyone, and there have been a number of people criticizing the response or calling the response into question, but there are people whose careers have been ruined by this, some of them justifiably and some of them maybe not so much. Yeah.
Thank you for all the good questions. And does anybody else have a final question? I know we're coming up on 6 o'clock here, but there's just been so much to learn. I mean, I feel like I have a whole bunch of questions that we need to talk another time. I want to talk about healthcare and I want to talk about college and I want to talk about all sorts of things between the countries. But to finish up today, does anybody have a last comment or two? Okay. Mariah, do you want? Paul, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, Paul, thank you so much. And I think we definitely, if we can make our time zones and our international date lines work, I'd love to have you back again, because obviously there's so much more that we could talk about. And I would like to take your class that you're teaching.
Sure. And maybe next, if and when I come next time, I'll organize time better and I'll make it a more digestible deluge of information. Yeah.
Hey,
I just want to say one thing before we go. First off, thanks for coming and chatting. But to Mr. Santori in the corner there, I'm really happy to see you here. I'm really glad that you were able to come, and I'm really glad that you've made it back to the land of the sentient. Awesome work. You're a strong man.
Yeah, and so as you all know, we like to end with a toast to kind of set us on our way and get us off to our evenings. And I was thinking, today about what the toast should be, and all kinds of things came to mind. But obviously, what I need to toast to is to Paul Santori and how great it is to see his face, and how much we're looking forward to having you back in Chestertown. And so that is our toast. So cheers to
Paul.
Cheers to Paul, and thank you to Paul Ware, and please do come back, and thank you all for coming, and we will get this video out in the next couple of weeks, and you can revisit it, and I think we'll try to have Paul back sometime soon to take it another step.
Thank you.
Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye, Paul S.